Are you a PDA parent raising a PDA child or teen? If so, this live is for you. I received a question on Facebook, I believe, that was specifically about what do I do if I'm a pathologically demand avoidant or pervasive drive for autonomy parent and I'm raising a PDA child or teen? Okay, so today I want to kick off Coffee with Casey with this question because I think it's an important one and I don't think I've talked a lot about it on my social media. However, it's something I think about and work with very much behind the scenes with my business of coaching and providing programs. So if you identify as a PDA parent or are beginning to explore whether or not you have a survival drive for autonomy and a sensitive nervous system, you are not alone. I would say about 1 in 5 parents that I have worked with either via coaching or in my programs is PDA identifying. And sometimes that happens through the process of going through the program and learning about their child's brain and nervous system or through coaching. So that's a pattern I notice, which does not surprise me because as we know, autism, neurodivergence, PDA specifically is a genetic experience, right? So it's a family experience. And often even when the parents themselves don't identify as PDA, they may be ADHD, autistic, or have a parent or sibling who was potentially undiagnosed neurodivergent growing up. So I really do think of this as a family experience. However, at the same time, I think that parents who are PDA have a unique experience with raising and caregiving for their PDA children and teens, and I'll explain why. So 2 of the key features of PDA children and teens are going to be directly activating to the nervous system of a PDA parent. So for example, as we know, PDA children and teens, their survival brain, amygdala, limbic system, perceives threat and sets off a nervous system response whenever there's not a perception of autonomy and equality. So the behavioral expression of that nervous system reaction is often what's called equalizing, which is reflexive and not behavioral. However, it feels like controlling behavior, and it's often the child destroying things of the safe person, correcting their words, controlling their line of vision. Sometimes it can be really activating, like you're stupid, that's not right, swearing at you. So this is activating to all humans. However, if your neuroception is doubly activated because when you perceive a loss of equality and your child is equalizing by trying to be above you, you're going to have extra nervous system activation, and you have a much more sensitive landscape of your nervous system because you've probably experienced activation throughout your life, whether or not you recognized the root cause. So it's going to be extremely activating. Additionally, one of the key features that we notice about PDA kids and teens is that they often need constant engagement, constant undivided attention, and constant signals of nervous system safety, which is part and parcel to a nervous system disability where they're constantly perceiving threat. They want that constant safe person to provide them a sense of bodily safety, right? However, this is a direct loss of autonomy for a PDA parent, right? Where they don't have the freedom and choice to do the dishes, speak to their partner, go outside, right? So this is difficult for any parent. However, I think it can be absolutely traumatic for a PDA parent who's experiencing this constant threat in their neuroception. So the third thing I want to say about this is often the PDA parent, and I will say that I think I have a biased sample because most of the PDA parents that I've worked with are in a more internalized expression. I'm not sure why that is. Potentially it's like a good fit with my temperament, or they see components of my experience with panic disorder, people pleasing, and perfectionism in their own experience, because those are themes that play out for them as well. But there's often an element of childhood or relationship trauma that is also compounded, because often a PDA parent has been raised in a more traditional setting where their needs were not accommodated. And so often it's even more difficult to make that mindset shift because they are triggered, right? Like they didn't have the accommodations that they're providing. However, on the flip side of things, what I have observed and I believe is that PDA parents are uniquely creative in finding accommodations and solutions. And I noticed this like even in my paradigm shift program with one of the coaches I hired. You know, it's just brilliant, the solutions and ideas she comes up with, because she has the similar, you know, type of alchemy, brilliant brain that a lot of these kids do. And so that's just an example, but also the empathy and connection that you can have on the other side of moving through some of that like really intense activation and potentially PTSD from your childhood. Okay, but I want to speak specifically to the question that I received on Facebook in terms of like small needle moving things you can do if you are a PDA parent. So I want to talk about in the moment, and then thinking more holistically, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions. So when I'm working with a PDA parent, and really any parent, but specifically a PDA parent, I bring in some Buddhist, like mindful and Buddhist tools, because so often we're either avoiding nervous system activation, negative thoughts and emotions, or we're grasping them. And so we want to get to a space where we're like the ocean, and the nervous system activation is waves. So how do we operationalize this? Like in the moment of activation, if you are a parent and your nervous system is going off, I encourage you to experiment with 1 to 3 seconds of a pause. Just like, and that's small, like before there's any reaction, pause, and then notice what part of your body you are feeling the activation in, okay? So this might look like you feel itchy all over your body. It might look like you have like pain in your chest. You might feel tingling up your spine. You might feel tunnel vision and you're starting to disassociate. So what we're doing right now is just observing in our bodies in that 1 to 3 second pause. And the practice will be to extend what I call the sacred pause, right? Of like, sometimes it's just 1 second that we're working on before we react. So in the pause, that's our opportunity to notice and observe what's going on in our body, and to have an awareness of like, oh, my hands start to tingle. Oh, I have tightness in my chest. Oh, I have a dagger in my heart. Okay. And then we observe that and bring self-compassion to it, right? Because I think for a lot of PDA parents, it's been something that's been made wrong about them. And so we want to start, you know, unraveling some of that and bringing compassion. So a very simple mantra you can bring to that noticing of your own nervous system activation that I use a lot myself is called "This belongs," right? So you notice the activation yourself and you can just say, "This belongs as part of my human experience," or simply, "This too." So we're allowing and observing and bringing self-compassion to this nervous system activation related to your neuroception. And this might be the very first step. And honestly, it will start with you bringing self-compassion to yourself, because there's nothing wrong with you having that activation. But I think for a lot of parents I've worked with, it has felt like there's something wrong with them when their nervous system activates. Okay, so that's like the in the moment practice that you can experiment with. And then more holistically, I just want to name 3 things that I often work on with families who have a PDA parent. One is understanding and leaning into regulation as something that's going to look different from potentially neurotypical peers or even other neurodivergent peers, which, often it's like, oh, you need to take a nap, you need to take a rest, you need to meditate. But remember that for the PDA brain, engaging and autistic brain, engaging in special interest might actually be much more regulating than, quote, resting, right? So I'll give you an anonymized example with a mom who was exploring her PDA identity, and she was postpartum, and so a lot of the narrative was like, you need to rest, you need to relax, you need to nap. Whereas what really regulated her nervous system and relaxed her was being very active in things like thrifting and transformation of her artistic of things that were much more active and artistic. So we set up ideas for like, okay, like when the baby and the other child is around, like how can we engage in some of these more like transformation activities, special interests that really regulate your nervous system, which is just a different way of looking at it from like how the world is going to be conditioning you to do self-care. The next thing I would say is like your child, your need for a safe nervous system can't be underestimated. And so what that looks like in real life holistically is really being honest with yourself about the scenarios, situations, and people who do not provide you a safe nervous system, whether it's in real life or online, and starting to set some boundaries, right? And if you have a history of like a more freeze-fawn internalized expression, this is going to be really difficult because you're going to be more of an automatic yes, fawning type. If you're externalized, this might not apply as much, but really starting to think about boundaries outside of the home, right? And so this is something that I struggled with, but one of the practices I read the book Boundary Boss, which I highly recommend, by Terry Cole, but I would set up a list every day, really small things, and I'd be like, okay, what's one thing I can say no to? And it might just be like unfollowing someone on Facebook, or it might be, just a random request that I got to participate in something and saying like no to protect my energy. So that's going to be really important, especially for those freeze-fawn expressions. And then finally, I think this is important for everyone, but particularly for a PDA parent, is finding meaning in what you're doing as a caregiver, right? Because otherwise it can feel like you're just trapped in this like cosmic mind F, because it's like you're presented with a situation that basically is like the worst fit in some ways until you cross that threshold for your nervous system. However, finding meaning in the practice of like the sacred pause and what you're doing to accommodate your child can really start to shift things and help you perceive more autonomy and agency in what you're doing. So what do I mean by this? I'll give you an example of my meaning, and then I'll give you some examples of others' meaning, and then we'll have time for a question. So if you guys haven't asked questions, feel free to do so. Okay, so I remember I had an aha moment when my son was sort of at his most activated, burned out, violent, where like much of my days were spent trying to keep my toddler safe and me physically in between my children. And I felt so much reactivity and anger and resentment towards my son. And like when I was kicked, screamed at, hit, had things thrown at me, I had these surges of like my own reactivity and, was sort of like a surge of my own violence inside of me. And I had this moment because in my past life, I did a doctorate degree in social science, and my dissertation was on basically nonviolence in the face of really extreme violence in a civil war in Colombia, South America. So I'd studied all these peace builders and gone into conflict zones and was like really learning about nonviolence in the response to perceived violence. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, Casey, you have a PhD in this, and you consider yourself nonviolent, and yet you can't control yourself in the face of a child, right? Like you can't control your own like wanting to yell at them or do something reactive. And I remember thinking to myself, wait, this is like such an opportunity to actually learn nonviolence versus like the academic objective observer. And so for me, the meaning became like, how can I actually practice nonviolence? Not just, obviously I never touched my son in that sense, but like the violence of aggression and the feeling of wanting to like, teach him a lesson or whatever. And so for me, it became like this spiritual practice of like, okay, between stimulus and response, I have agency, and like, where is that nonviolence? So for parents who are PDA, often this can look like the opportunity to find meaning by parenting and accommodating their child in a way that they weren't accommodated. It can be viewed as like healing intergenerational trauma or stopping the cycle of trauma in their family. It can also take on a meaning beyond just the home of like social justice, of like, I'm teaching my child how to manage their disability and how to, create a more equal collaborative home, which is like the seed that we plant to ripple out into society. So those are just some examples of meaning that we can find in a more holistic way. So I hope that's helpful to that parent or any other parent who is either identifies as PDA or exploring their PDA identity, which is very common. I've learned as I've worked with so many parents. Okay, so let's see if we have questions. I do have a yoga class that I'm going to go. Embodying nonviolent communication with the PDA family is really the work. Yeah, 100%. Meanwhile, nonviolent communication is how I was living my life up to that point. Yeah, that's awesome. But it's hard. Like you think that you're nonviolent and you think that you have these values, but then when you're faced with what your body perceives as violence, you realize like it's not as easy as what you read or learn about in a book, right? It's like, oh, this is what it actually feels like. Just wondering if you can recommend any books that would be helpful for PDA parents to read. So I think The Body Keeps the Score is an awesome book to understand, like, even though it's not specifically about PDA, it's like all about the mechanisms of fight, flight, freeze. And then the last third of the book is like body-based approaches to therapy or, supporting that trauma response, because the whole point of the book is like the experience of perceiving threat and what happens to your nervous system, whether it's your neuroception or, the evocative cues of a traumatic incident or a combination. It's all housed in the body and it stays there. So if we're focused on like talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or trying to like name emotions and talk about them, well, that can be helpful in developing our awareness of like some of the root causes. It won't necessarily address like the physiology of what your body's experienced. So the last third of the book is like all the different modalities. Like it talks about neurofeedback, it talks about EMDR, it talks about art and therapy and movement. So that's one I really like. I think finding the accounts of other PDA autistic adults that you identify with, I can just rattle off a few. So Christy Forbes, In Play We Trust, I really like her stuff on TikTok and on Instagram. Sally Cat on Facebook, more internalized expression. Demi Burnett, more externalized. Her tag is Demi Not Lovato, and she talks about her lived experience. Sorry, my thing is going off. There's a lot of writings on neuroclastic. Dr. Mel Hauser's work on All Brains Belong. I think there's just so many accounts that can make us feel like we belong, right? And so that's where I would start, right? I think understanding the nervous system and then also finding that you're not alone. I think the book PDA by PDAers, which was compiled by Sally Cat, is a really good one as well. I've read that one and enjoyed it. So I hope that's helpful to you. Let's see if we have any other questions. Yeah, I think I have time for one more. Yeah. Your PDA child has moved to a behavioral modification classroom. Surprised it's not going well. Yeah, because it's not behavior. It's the nervous system activation, right? And it's like, you know, if I'm having a nervous system response to perceived threat, it's not going to help me if I'm like in fight or flight to be like, don't do that, Casey, right? Or like, you get this taken away. So yeah, it's just, unfortunately, this is the paradigm shift of like moving from understanding, and this is what Monadella Hook talks about in her Beyond Behaviors, of like understanding behaviors as not necessarily motivated, manipulative, goal-oriented. And of course, some behaviors are, but I think so often we revert to the logic of that with the children who are neurodivergent PDA and having a tough time or have a trauma history, and we're just driving them deeper into the panic response. And so, you know, I feel very passionately about shifting that paradigm. And I know all of you do as well, because that's why you're here. Yeah, Emily says, my son won't go to school, won't cooperate with homeschool. He's 17. Yeah, so you might want to start with just like deschooling and focus on like the nervous system accommodations, because you're resetting, I assume, after like lots and lots of years of approaching it through a typical child lens. I mean, I'm making assumptions here, but often when parents come to the page or my work or my programs with teens, they've often been working through a different logic for a long time. So of course it's going to take a really long time to establish a new paradigm. Yeah. Okay. I'm trained in Reggio philosophy. Child-led learning is the next step in supporting all children, but PDA children make this even more evident. Schools are not set up for kids. Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, my friends, I hope this was helpful. I will see you next week at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, and it was great to be with you. Okay, bye.